for this afternoon is David Kitto, Executive Director of the Department of Planning. And his topic here is lessons learned from assessing major projects in New South Wales. He's done a fair few of those. So, welcome, David.
Hello everyone. Some famous person once said, "Let there be light," and there was. Turns out that's not always such a good thing. But thank you for inviting me to talk at the conference today. It really is a privilege to be up here in this awe-inspiring environment, to see the observatory firsthand, and the setting here within the Warren Bungalows is quite amazing. My name is David Kitto, as it says there, and I'm an Executive Director within the Department of Planning and Environment. And for about the last 20 odd years, I've been responsible for the environmental assessment of resources and energy projects in New South Wales. That all happens within a statutory framework, and that framework is now, for the last 30 or 40 years, has been governed by the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, which is administered by the Minister for Planning, who's Minister Roberts at the moment. And I work for the department who works for the Minister. Now that Act has three functions really. One is to do some planning, so to set the rules for assessment, to work out what land uses should be where, and how to avoid land use conflicts. The second key function is to assess development under those rules. And there really are two or three types of development that sit within that scheme. There's local development, which is your houses and shops and all that regular stuff that happen in towns and cities and so on. Then you get regional development, which is a sort of notch up and could have significant impacts on the environment. And then you get state significant development, where the state has said either for some economic, social, or environmental reason, the state should make the final decision on those projects. And they can be projects that are important for economic reasons, but also projects in sensitive environmental areas. Now, within that framework, you do get major freeways and highways and transport infrastructure. You get major gas pipelines and so on. You can get ports and so on, big residential subdivisions, but really what I've worked on in the last 20 odd years, as I said, is resources and energy assessment, which includes the big metalliferous mines in the central west and far west, the coal mines within the Hunter Valley, Southern Coalfield and Wollongong, and then more recently in the northern areas north of Mudgee and in the Gunnedah Basin in more recent years. It includes gas development in New South Wales, not that there is much compared to Queensland. And then it also includes gas and coal-fired power stations, and then more recently wind farms, solar farms, and pumped hydro. So it covers a broad scheme of development. Process is a pretty standard environmental impact assessment process. If someone has a proposal, it needs to be permissible on the land, although there are some powers that can override those. They need to get requirements from the state government in terms of what they need to assess. Proponents then need to go and prepare an environmental impact statement. That's put on exhibition. Public gets to comment. There's then a formal response, or the proponent needs to provide a formal response to that. In some circumstances, the Minister can call public hearings, but ultimately an assessment report is written, and then the Minister or the Independent Planning Assessment Commission will make a decision. Now that process seldom happens in under a year and can often grind on for 2 or 3 years. So it's not a short process, and despite the scepticism of some, there is a fair bit of science and investigation and rigor in that process. And ultimately, the obligations in the Act are to make a triple bottom line assessment, and it doesn't specify you need to give more weight to the economics of the environment. It really is at the discretion of the decision. One of the interesting things, though, about the job is the relationship between policy and practice and the way the two interact with each other. In an ideal world, you would develop all the policy up front and then simply apply the rules. But as I'm sure a lot of you know, life doesn't work like that. And very often, issues come out of practice that then create challenges for science. And then ultimately policy follows quite some time later. And just when you think you've worked everything out at a policy level, you find out the science isn't that great and there's a lot more to learn. And then you've got some different projects that come out in different atmospheres, and so you start all over again. So it is a complicated process. And it's always subject to change. But today what I'd like to talk about is lighting impacts of major resource projects and some of the lessons that we've learned over the last 20 years. I think it's fair to say that lighting impacts don't show up on the list of key issues of major resource projects too often. We tend to get the dust and the noise and the blasting impacts. And then you get the impacts on the water systems, both groundwater and surface water, impacts on floodplains. There's the biodiversity impacts associated with a lot of the caring, and then they get a lot of the heritage impacts, Aboriginal heritage and so on. But it's fair to say that lighting impacts have taken on a much greater importance over the last decade, and we've had to spend a lot of time and effort getting a better understanding of the issue and working out how we might regulate it or minimise impacts and regulate it in a better way. And when I talk about these impacts, primarily I am talking about the impacts on people, although increasingly the focus is turning to the impacts on plants and animals. But it also is about impacts on critical infrastructure like the Siding Springs Observatory, and paying attention to all sorts of infrastructure that's required to make a state work properly, and the importance of maintaining dark skies in some part of the state. So where should I start? Can anyone tell me where that is? That's the Hunter Valley, or part of the Hunter Valley in the 1960s. Yeah. That's the Hunter Valley as it was a couple of years ago. So in the last what you have there today is about 30 quite large open cut mines, but they are a combination of open cut mines between the two major cities of Muscat. And that's probably been one of the biggest engineering projects ever carried out in Australia. And although some people always say it's rape and pillage in the Hunter Valley, it probably is something I probably haven't seen any project that's been planned to within an inch of its life in many ways. Now, if you read the dark sky guideline, each mine produces about 5 million lumens of light, and if you put 30 of those together, you've got 150 million lumens of light coming out of the valley every day, and that's probably an underestimate when you consider the scale of the mine there, that most of those mines probably have more light. So what you really have there is, when you combine the two towns, there's a huge light source within that part of the world. Now, in all these, because it's primarily open cut, you do get a lot of light from the mine. Now that light you can be on fixed plants around washeries or around administrative offices where they stockpile the coal and so on. And a lot of those are fixed light sources there to make it easier to navigate. also get a lot of mobile plant that moves around. It's not that mobile, drag line. We get trucks and shovels and bulldozers and so on. And they move around. It's much harder to regulate because they're here for 4 or 5 years or 2 or 3 nights, and then they're moving to another place and another place. So it does pose challenges in terms of how you might minimise those impacts. Now, it'd be fair to say when I started, as much as you think Sligo would be a massive achievement, because it's happened progressively, a lot of people are really quite used to it. And so it's very incremental. If there is an extension, it tends to be a very localised impact in and around where it happens. The primary impact that we come across or came across in those days was really the nuisance effect of mobile plant, or the glare, or the light trespass impacts of lighting. Where it would be shining in someone's window, equipment would be working up on some dump, the plant would be shining into someone's window and keeping them up and making them cranky. They would phone up the mine, and really it wasn't something that was expressly regulated at all. But as the scale of mining increased in that area, the number of complaints increased, and really it moved from being something that was dealt with by, in a good neighbour way. Someone pick up the phone and say, "That's annoying me," and the mining company would respond. Really started to become something that was regulated expressly. So it started to be something that was conditioned, so that if somebody didn't want to be a good neighbour, you could enforce the requirement to do those sorts of things. And that really evolved over time, because what you tended to see there was, once you started regulating it, that started driving changes in the design. So you started to see, people thinking about whether they were going to put their fixed plant, having screening or funds and so on around those places, or planting tree screening, so they could really mitigate the impacts. Starting to think about what sort of lights they would use, whether they would be shielded or not, and so on. And so that drove a lot of change. We also started focusing more and more mobile plants. So you've got innovation in the sorts of plant being used, and swivel heads being used, so you didn't have to move the whole machine if you wanted to regulate the light. And so a lot of technological improvements and so on came about. And essentially it became part of standard practice in mining. And we really ended up with a set of standard conditions which reference the Australian standard. And because things move around with mines, it's quite hard to sort of get right down to point source and say this light must be like this and this light must be like that. There are so really that's where things sit in a kind of standard condition sense on mining. Now, the nature scale of development in New South Wales has changed quite a lot over the last 10 to 15 years. As things have changed, from a construction sand point of view, a lot of the sand sources in Sydney, Sydney is very hungry for construction sand, with all the construction going on, have been used up. Places like Penrith Lakes are closing down. And so what's happened is a lot of the construction companies have moved much further afield. And so some of the big quarry companies have moved down to Maroon, down to Goulburn, and they've set up some very big quarries there, which are not like the standard quarries that people would be used to 10 to 15 years ago. They are mini mines in a sense, and they've got rail loops attached to them, and they rail a lot of that construction sand back up to Sydney. So the scale of these operations is much bigger, and you're starting to have 24-hour, 24/7 operations rather than daytime operations. So what you're starting to get around these things is more and more lighting. We've also had highway upgrades at the Pacific Highway and the Hume Highway, where as the road goes up, you can really track a whole lot of major quarry. What that's really done is expand some of the bigger quarries up and down the East Coast and down into that rural area. With the mining boom a number of years ago, there was a large expansion of mining. And some of the big mining out of the Hunter Valley. So you had a number of large mines setting up in that area to the north of Mudgee, around Ulan. And you also had a number of mines starting up in the Gunnedah area, really between Werris Creek and Narrabri. So you have about 7 mines operating in that area now, and another one under assessment, and you've got 3 in that Mudgee area. You've got the Narrabri Gas Project, which is about 100 odd kilometres to the north of here. And then as the debate about how we should generate our energy has increased, we've had more and more wind farm applications, and at the moment there really is a solar rush on the go, and we've got more solar applications than ever before. And as you get more wind and solar applications, we're starting to get pumped hydro applications as a way of providing that battery storage to smooth that energy out. So fundamentally, as a lot of the old coal-fired power stations come to the end of their economic life, decisions are made about the changes. That's driven a lot of development from an energy or resources and energy perspective. That's driven a lot of development in rural areas, which requires lighting. Now, it's a bit small, but that really is a map of, I'll just get the pointer out. So we are down here at the observatory. But if you'd looked at this map 15 years ago, it would have been the light. So you've got a number, would have been dominated by a lot of the lighting from the towns in the area. But really within the last 10 years, you've got some major new light sources in this area. So you've got the Narrabri coal mine opening up here. You've got the Moores Creek and Boggabri and Tarrawonga coal mines up here in Lead State Forest. Now if you look at that, that creates nearly as much light as the whole of Tamworth, that mining complex. So really along the western side of the observatory, I think it's about 100, it varies between 120 to 150 kilometres away. You have all these new light sources here, and in this area around here, you have a potential coal seam gas project, the Narrabri gas project. And so what a lot of that's, you know, some of the assessment of those applications would have been similar to what we were seeing in the Hunter Valley. Probably more of an emphasis on sky glow for some people because there would have been a change, the relative change in light in some of those rural areas would have been much more significant than what people were used to. And some of those landscapes have gone from being solely rural to partly rural industrial. The bigger thing that started, one of the big strategic issues that started coming out with a lot of that development was what are the impacts on the Siding Springs Observatory. Now that's not something that we had dealt with before, and it's not something that came to our attention overnight. It really was something that started incrementally because the mining in this area started out quite small scale, with a small little mine at Canyon and then another reasonably small mine at Werris Creek. But towards the end of the 2000s, really, the project started to get a bit bigger. And so we started to get submissions from the observatory saying we're really worried about the lighting impacts on the observatory. Now that brings me back to my comments in terms of we don't really know how to assess this. What's the science saying? How do I take, you know, what the observatory is saying, bring it down to a project level? So it raises all sorts of questions that we hadn't dealt with before. And it probably started, as I said, it started out quite incrementally. It was more a couple of submissions and the impacts were quite minor on those particular mines, but it started a discussion. And so it was started out and there was a bit more consultation and assessment. And then you started getting some conditioning that was flowing through. But ultimately what that led to was the dark sky planning guidelines. And then I guess where you start to go from something coming out of assessment, moving into policy saying this is an important piece of infrastructure It plays an important role in global astronomy, and it is something that needs to be protected. And combine that with the Warren that guideline, and that didn't come about overnight. I'm sure there are people in this room who spent more hours than they would have liked getting it up and lobbying politicians. And but you have a guideline which sets some rules or guidance for how we should deal with these things. What it does is, rather than set limits for individual developments, which are quite difficult to do, given the varied nature of development in an area like this, what it did was it set a maximum tolerable level of artificial light for the observatory. And that's really a cumulative impact standard, saying we can't let the artificial light get to this maximum tolerable level. And I'm not going to quote the level because it would be a number. But what that guideline also does is it sets out a whole lot of things to consider, and it also sets out some really good principles that you can apply or use to think about assessing individual projects. That guideline was given statutory effect in our legislation, both through the Act and the regulations. And in the infrastructure set, which is a state environmental planning policy, any big development or any development within 200 kilometres of the observatory needs to be referred to the director of the observatory for comments and consultation during the assessment process. So there's guidance on assessment, there's obligation to consult, and then there's a mandatory consideration to take that into account, the impacts of the development into account on the observatory in any final decision. And there's really two ways that it does that. There's that guidance in those local government areas and the towns. It sets some strict standards for individual development. And it doesn't require consultation in every carport and every this, because that wouldn't be practical. But it does. In a bigger area, it requires that consultation and assessment. And this, whoops, sorry, wrong. Within this area, here you've got the Narrabri gas project, and in the southern areas where those mines to the north of Mudgee are. So within that 200 metre area, a lot of the new mines that have come pose risks for the ongoing operation of the observatory. As I said, the guideline has a whole lot of guidance on these things, and I won't go into all the principles, but those principles don't just apply to development within those 200 kilometres. They can really be applied to any development in the state, and we quite commonly do that with lighting as an issue. So what particularly in this part of the world, one of the issues that's come up recently on the Narrabri gas project is there's a lot of guidance in those guidelines about what to do with fixed light sources but there's nothing in there about what you do with the coal seam gas flare. And this is a situation of where, you just think you've got it all bedded down, you've gone through a 10-year process, you've got your guideline, you've got the statutory protection, decision makers have to take into account, and it's like, well, so this is what they call an appraisal flare at the Narrabri gas project. And when you're doing your exploration, you bring the gas up out of the ground, it needs to go somewhere, and if it's not connected up to a power station or something, you need to flare it to the atmosphere. And so these stacks can commonly be, they can be, just give me a second, they can be about 6 metres high, And the flame, depending on how much gas is coming out of them, can probably get about 1.5 meters to anything up to 4 meters high, depending on whether it's coming fast or slow. So that can be about 10 to 15 meters high. So they create light. But that's just an appraisal flare. If you do go to a full gas field and you have a gas plant, you need to prepare for emergencies. And if you're closing your gas plant down to maintain it, you need some safety flares. And those are much taller. They can be 50-meter stacks, and they can have flares of up to 30 meters. So that can be sort of an 80-meter flare. So in the Narrabri gas project, which is about 100 kilometres to the north of here, there is a proposal that Santos has to put in a gas field there. They've already got some exploration wells there and a couple of flares, but they are proposing to put 850 wells there and to put a large gas plant and to connect that up to the gas network on the East Coast. Now, we are still in the assessment process. But parts of that proposal are like a traditional mine. There's a construction of a gas plant. So these are fixed things. There's drilling of wells with some lighting. There'll be some dust where you will have to do dust suppression. So there are some standard elements here, and they will be much smaller than anything compared to the open cuts to the rest of the field. But in terms of the flare, they could be significant. And the appraisal flares go all the time, these smaller flares, and they could have up to about 6 of those. But the safety flares really only go off infrequently. So if you need to do maintenance or if there's an emergency, so they may not happen for a year or two, but they will happen at some stage, and they will create quite a bit of light when they occur. So one of the issues, we went through our standard process. There was Santos and the department spoke to the observatory beforehand. Santos was required to go and assess the impacts on the observatory. We went away and did that in accordance with the dark sky guidelines to have a lot of guidance on flaring. So the assessment in the EIS didn't really grapple in a serious way with the impact of the flaring. And the observatory put in, when we consulted the observatory, they said, well, you haven't done the flaring. And so Santos, in responding to the submissions, went away and got a detailed study done on what the flaring impacts might be. Now, we've never seen one of these things before. You know, what data do you need to do a flare impact assessment on an observatory? You know, what method do you use? What assumptions are reasonable? So there's a whole range of scientific questions that flow from what's going to happen about the flares. And so that, you know, this is new for us. We don't have a guideline that says you need to go and do X, Y, and Z, and you just go away and do it. It requires people to go away and really think about how they might assess these things, to potentially get it peer reviewed and get the methodology checked before you then go through the process. Now, it's a very interesting study if you want to go and look on our website. But what they really did is they went through a really technical assessment. And what they found is, you know, in terms of the appraisal wells, it would be very hard to get a direct line of sight between the observatory and the wells, because there are a lot of trees in and around the Pilligo that are about 20 metres high, so there would be some shielding. But with the safety flares, there would be a direct line of sight. And in terms of sky glow with the appraisal wells, I think they were saying the horizontal spread would be about 1 kilometre, and the vertical would be about 500 metres. But when you really did the safety flares, that could extend out to about 12 kilometres and up to about 4 kilometres. So now you do have a standard within the dark planning guideline, but it is a cumulative standard. And in both situations, what they were saying is they were well below the 30 degrees that was set in the standard. And so essentially saying that the impact from that flaring would be negligible. And the added factor is that a lot of your concern would be about the safety flaring. That wouldn't happen regularly. And sometimes you would have control of that because it would be about maintenance, so you could mitigate those impacts. Now, I read a lot of technical reports and they can be very dry, but I do have two of my favourite passages that I've ever read that come out of this. And I want to quote them. So the first one is, the illuminance from the direct light reaching the observatory would be 0.001 lux, which is less than Venus on a clear night. And for the context, the frequency and extent of the non-routine flaring event is significantly less than the frequency of a quarter moon rising in the northeast region on a clear night. So we've taken mining assessment from the terrestrial to the celestial, which is precisely where it should be when you consider, the importance of astronomy and what it can tell us about the past and the future, and also to broader debates about sustainability and how we should be going. Now, the observatories reviewed that study and written to us and said, we accept the flaring during routine and emergency impacts won't have a significant impact on the observatory. But obviously raising the issue that the standards that we're using are cumulative standards, and it's not going to be the only development that happens in this area. And so there is a need, while the impacts may be acceptable, to mitigate the impacts. And so there is a request for, during routine flaring of maintenance, it would be preferred that when the moon, it should be carried out when the moon is more than 50% illuminated. So we will have a change to our standard conditions if the Narrabri project is ever approved. So moving to things that are closer to the ground or on hills. One of the things which we've had a lot more of in the last 10 years has been wind farm development or wind farm proposals. Over the last 15 years, the state government has approved 25 large-scale wind farms across the state. 8 of those have been built and are operational, and 4 of them are being built at the moment. They tend to be up and down the Great Dividing Range, but the primary concentrations of the wind farms are down in the Southern Highlands, around the Krupel and Yass area, and also in the area around Gleneagles to the north of the state. Now, in the early days, the turbines that were being proposed or built were between 100 and 130 metres high. But now, with technology change and so on, they are looking at putting turbines in there about 200 metres high. So these are very, very significant industrial structures. Now, the assessment of wind farms has always been contested, and very often the arguments in the assessment process are about visual impacts, about noise, and about impacts on biodiversity. Now, when it comes to visual, they are about impacts on the broader rural landscape, but also on particular houses, much like you get in mining assessment. Now, it's interesting that some of the issues raised in the Southern Highlands are a bit different than the issues raised in the Gleneagles area, but consistently people are concerned about visual impacts. Now, one of the other issues with turbines as they get taller and taller is what happens to all those aeroplanes flying around, and particularly if they're operating at night. Can they see them? Now, what does happen is they do get fed into a system and they show up on radar like all tall structures. But as they've sort of progressively got taller from the 130 metre mark to 150 mark, CASA, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, has come up with a policy. And like a lot of these policies in the early days, it's a fairly simple policy. And what it's saying is, sorry, I'll just skip that bit. So what it's saying is, if you've got a proposal and you've got turbines of 150 metres high, you need to carry out an aeronautical risk assessment. You need to do that in consultation with CASA.
So what would happen is they would, much like would have to go and assess the aviation hazard risks of those turbines. We would then consult with CASA. CASA would tell us whether they think it's a hazard or not. If they think it's a hazard and it can't be mitigated, they would need to delete the turbine. It could be a hazard that could be managed through lighting, or it may not be a hazard. So it's a pretty simple process. The issue is there's no clear criteria about what constitutes a hazard and the significance of the hazard. So while there is an acknowledgement it could create hazard, it is a fertile ground for argument about what sort of hazard and how significant that hazard is, because the detailed policy around that hasn't been developed yet. And if lighting is required, the broad principle is you need to minimise the impacts of that lighting. Now, until recently, none of the wind farm operators had been obliged to put in lighting, either because they were out Broken Hill and the risks were very, very low, and it could be managed through aviation. But in some certain areas now, with the bigger turbines, CASA is saying we need to put the lighting in. And it is one of those interesting interactions between the Commonwealth and the state, where the state gets to approve the wind farm, but the Commonwealth has safety powers that can come over the top of it, and even if the state doesn't require lighting, they can say, well, it's a hazard and you have to put the lighting in. So we consult with each other, but they have their own powers. Now, what we found is there's a wind farm up in Glen Innes area that is about 200, it's got turbines 200 metres that are 200 metres tall. And there is an airport up in that area, and there's quite a bit of aviation. And so CASA has required them to put lights in. And there was a big argument about whether that should happen because it's quite expensive. And consultants on the one side said it wasn't necessary, and the consultants at CASA said it was, and the lights have been put in. And when they got turned on, the complaints came streaming in from all these sheep farmers around that area saying, we don't like it at all. So what that's triggered is a round of investigations, and that's only just begun, but it's turning at the moment to, well, they're there now, do they need to be on all the time? Can they be, can you change it? Can you do this? Can you do that? And in some ways, it's a bit like mining in the old days in the Hunter Valley. I suspect we will go through a number of iterations over time and get towards some more fixed policy on these sorts of things. So at the moment, there are some guiding principles, there's some policy, but it's not developed quite enough to give certainty and guidance on these sorts of things. And obviously, people's behaviour and how people respond to these things, given they're quite new things in the environment, are things we're only just beginning to get a better understanding of. We are dealing with a lot of solar farms, but for those of you who are interested in lighting, there is almost none. They operate in the day, and there may be a bit of plant on site, which is very easy to manage, so it doesn't raise issues. But the last one I wanted to talk about before finishing, sorry, that's just an example of the wind farm. And it covers a very, very big area of wind farms. And this is one where there's a debate going at the moment in the assessment process between CASA and the proponent and ourselves about whether it should be lit. And if it were, all those red dots in the middle there are the turbines that would need to be lit. Now, it does create issues. There will be a little bit of sky glow, but not much. The issue is more about direct impact on people, but more than this, it's probably a new thing that we're dealing with, is visual clutter on the landscape, which is where a lot of these are placed on ridge lines. And ridge lines are not flat. And so what you have is, you will have, and if they move, you could get the Catherine wheel effect. And what you did find in one area, which was an application we recommended refusal for, was rather than being on a ridge line, it was actually down in the valley, and there were quite a few people up, and the turbines would have been at house level. So it really depends on the context and the area. But they are raising new visual issues as opposed to shining into my bedroom. It is more of a visual landscape rural landscape with clutter that's kind of lit up at night. So we'll see where that ends up. I'm not sure at the moment.
David, can I just ask, is the cooler sort of, they, sorry, my big move from here, they're below the level?
They are. That doesn't mean to say it won't be required to meet some stage, but they're not required to do that. So we've also, over time, developed some standard conditions for wind farms. One of the last projects I'm working on or talk about is the proposed Snowy Hydro 2.0, and that's based wholly within the Kosciuszko National Park. Now, given the important role it could play, but it is completely within a national park. Now, a lot of the power stations, if it ever is built, will be underground. There will be a whole range of ancillary infrastructure that will be required. Now, we haven't got the EIS for that yet, but clearly, when you start to go through the dust and the noise and the biodiversity, it does come down to, what is the value of dark skies in a national park? And from a lighting point of view, there will be lighting impacts. What is our approach to assessing these impacts, and what kind of criteria and standards do you use to judge the acceptability of those impacts? Now, again, I don't know the answer to those things, but there will be things that we need to work out, and there will be different things to what we've had to do in the past. So it's never a dull moment. But what I would say is it's been an interesting 20-odd years working on these sorts of projects. Lighting is still not really a determinative issue on these projects, but it is growing in importance. We've learned a lot. We've learned, how to drive better design, how to assess things better, how to regulate them better, and how to reduce impacts. But there still are impacts on people, and there's still impacts on plants and animals in around some of these big developments. And I guess those are some of the trade-offs that decision makers need to take into account when they make decisions on these big projects. But the thing that strikes me most is the more you learn, the more you realise you've got to learn. And I always remember there's one of my favourite consultants who's been around forever, old man in a cardi. And I asked him what I thought was a very simple question one day. And he said, if he'd asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have known the answer. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions today? This is just for mine. So you said 7 operating mines and 1 under assessment in the Gunnedah Basin. Is the 1 under assessment Vickery Extension?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So does that mean that Watermark has got to go?
No, Watermark got approved.
Yes, but it
hasn't been constructed. They haven't got a mining lease and it hasn't been constructed.
And the main Vickery mine, is that?
It's not operating at the moment, but it has an approval.
Yes.
But what they're looking to do is to probably double the
production
rates
with the extension. So yeah, so that was my question. The Vickery and Watermark haven't been started.
No, they haven't been started. So to say operating is probably not.
Yeah, that's what you're saying.
So that map I showed of this Lead Forest, Narrabri and Werris Creek, that's probably where things are up to. And then you have Vickery and Watermark.
Thank you. Christine?
Oh, I saw on one of your slides that it said that the mines are watershed.
Yes.
Yeah. And my question is, who does that? Okay. And does it get done? And then what happens if they get compliant?
So compliance happens in a number of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a compliance team, and the Department of Planning is responsible for lighting impacts. So we have a compliance team, and they routinely will go out and check mines. So that's not part of the 3-year audit.
Okay.
So that happens on a regular basis. We've got people up in Gunnedah, we've got people down across the state, and they do that sort of checking. And that checking can be in response to complaints. So people say, the light's shining in the room, or I'm not happy with this. But it can also be driven by other agencies saying there's problems. Or it could be, random checks. So that's routine. But what we require for a lot of these other mines is annual reporting. So they have to report all the complaints and so on. We can check them. But what we require is an independent audit to be carried out every 3 years, and for that to be published. So that is carried out by an independent team of experts that the department would sign off on, and they would go away and independently audit it, and that report will be made public and published on our website, and the company will need to respond to that. So it's not that we do it every 3 years; it's that it's a sort of mandatory independent audit.
Is it just mines that go through that?
No, it's pretty common now for big projects, particularly projects where it's ongoing. So some projects, say wind farm, there's a lot of impact when it's been constructed. But once it's been constructed, there's less checking to do. Whereas an open cut mine, there's checking to be done all the time, and it's in some ways it increases following construction.
Can I ask, sorry, Lisa, just whether Malt's Creek has been checked? Because that's
Yes.
been operating now for about
Yes.
2 years.
Yes.
How
Yes.
how did
I mean,
it-
it's I mean, the independent audit stuff, you can go and check for yourself
Oh,
on the
yeah,
website.
Yeah, okay, great.
But in terms of, Maules Creek generates a lot of complaints.
Yes.
So from conservation groups about tearing in the forest, and Aboriginal groups and local residents. So there is a lot of checking that goes on, and not just by planning, but EPA and other agencies who have responsibilities to maintain those mines.
So you don't give up your position, Kelly, but
Yeah, so the cumulative impact
Yep.
issue, I just wonder how you're going to deal with that when you've got 10 mines that have been approved with existing light levels and 5 more want to come in and add to that and push you over that limit that you've established for here. What about the 10 that are there already? Are they going to have to reduce their lighting and balance out, or how do you deal with that?
Look, it's hard to speculate about what's going to happen in the future. Probably in the mining boom, there was this expectation there would be a lot more mining here than probably there would be or would be. And who knows what the future holds in terms of how energy is going to be generated. But so it's hard to crystal ball gaze. I guess what we do have at the moment is a standard, and where things are relative to that standard. So I think we still are in the dark sky realm, but it will continue to be monitored. And obviously, if it starts edging up, then that will open up debate about what sort of development should be allowed. That decisions will need to be made about
Light trading,
Well,
carbon trading. I mean,
like anything, it will be a political decision based on the values of the time.
We have a huge issue with cumulative light WA. The whole coastline is now becoming eliminated.
Yeah.
And every mine says, well, you have to assess me in isolation. You can't assess me relative to the rest. And it's a real issue.
No, I agree.
No more questions?
One question about the planning assessment committee recommendation to the politicians. Do the politicians accept the planning assessment committee?
So in New South Wales, the minister doesn't make decisions on these projects. So he's delegated, mining issues to the independent planning commission, so they make those decisions.
But it's not political.
The decisions are made by an independent body. So they're not in previous times they were made by ministers, but they're not made by ministers now. Now, the only qualifier to that is most of the decisions are made by the Independent Planning Commission, But there are a few that are made by departmental officers under delegation. Those tend to be those where there's less public interest and the smaller modifications. So in those situations, the department is acting as the minister's delegate. So technically, the minister is making the decision, but really all the big decisions are made by an independent body and not the minister. That's the changes that have been put in place after things like the ICAP inquiries and so on to make those.
Last question. Last question for you now. We've got a panel coming up shortly, so you can probably ask those questions then. Last question.
Satellite photos of the students and the lights showing up would show that gas birds are a really big problem. It strikes me that 90% of the problem disappeared very easily by simply by putting that cylindrical tube around the flare. Really economical solution. And that might be the easiest way to go.
So I do know that work's going on about whether you do, horizontal flaring rather than vertical flaring, but again, we don't have as much experience in New South Wales as in Queensland, and so we're still finding out about some of this stuff. But in terms of how you might mitigate, if it is going to happen, how you might mitigate that, I think the engineers will continue to work on those things and try and work that out, especially if they're pressed to do it by regulators.
Okay, we have a panel, so would you like to thank